Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at EverQuest Legends, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game otherwise known as an MMORPG, developed by GameJawn and published by Daybreak Games, releasing on the Windows computer platform on July 28th, 2026. We're going to talk all about that game and why it's important and why we're covering that game today in just a couple minutes. But first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall. Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Vince Gameplays, Hammond Egger, XDeath, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into EverQuest Legends, I figured it'd be a good idea to let everybody know why we're talking about EverQuest Legends on today's episode of the podcast. And the simple reason is because I have unfinished business. ISO, what are you doing?
Tony, I'm going to let you finish, but Final Fantasy X was the greatest Pantheon entry of all time. Of all time!
Can we get some security here?
Get your hands off of me. Wait. I've got more to say. I speak for the people of the CGT community. Get off of me. Little Big Adventure sucks, guys. Symphony of the Night was robbed. It was robbed.
Well, that was entirely unexpected. I guess there was a little bit of consternation about our last week's Pantheon ranking episode. And actually, I know there was, because out on Discord, everybody, so just a tangent before we get back to EverQuest Legends. Last week, we posted our Year 4 Pantheon recap, where we went through and I ranked all of my top 10 Pantheon entries for the past year. And to say that I got a little bit of pushback, maybe it's probably not strong enough, to say that there was shock that Final Fantasy X did not make it into the top 10 Pantheon entries for the past year would be a little bit of an understatement. All I can say is, listen, it's the way I felt. I'm not saying Final Fantasy X was a bad game. I'm just saying it wasn't one of my personal top 10 entries from the past year. But boy, if you're not on Discord, you should be. But if you're not on Discord, you don't know what I'm talking about. But I heard it. I heard it loud and clear. I don't think there was a single person that was happy with the fact that Final Fantasy X was not on our top 10 list. And obviously ISO took matters into his own hands. ISO was on the Final Fantasy X episode with us when we did it. And it was his sponsored episode. We talked about it for 3 hours on that episode. We did a whole Sounds of the Classics on Final Fantasy X. Man, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to all who may be offended by my selection for the top 10 Pantheon entries. Final Fantasy X, definitely a good game, just not one of my top 10 from the past year. So, hey, I guess that it is what it is. But anyway, thank you, ISO, for letting everybody know your opinion. Anyway, moving back to EverQuest Legends. Why are we talking about EverQuest Legends, which is a game that at the point this episode is releasing, which is Monday, July 27th, 2026. At the point of this episode's release, EverQuest Legends hasn't even come out yet. It hasn't even officially released yet, which means, well, what the heck are we doing? Because everybody knows that the way that we have conducted this podcast up to this point has been you have to be 20 years or older, meaning a game has to be 20 years or older in order to get an episode of the podcast, except when we're doing the old is new kind of episodes and all that kind of stuff. But EverQuest Legends hasn't even released yet. So what could I possibly say about EverQuest Legends? Why are we covering that today? The simple answer is, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, that I have unfinished business. I have unfinished business with EverQuest. For anybody who listened to our EverQuest Nostalgia Trip episode from, I guess it must be a couple years ago at this point or so, maybe 2.5 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly, whenever it was. If anybody listened to that episode, you will likely recall that I loved EverQuest. I have such fond memories. I'm going to say it. I think EverQuest might be my favorite game of all time. Just the combination of everything from the gameplay to the exploration to the friendships and relationships that were built either within my server or with my guild or whatever. It was just a magical time for me. I played EverQuest a lot when it came out. I got into EverQuest just to give a little bit of a recap of my personal experience with EverQuest, the original EverQuest. I got into EverQuest right around the time that the Scars of Velius expansion pack had released. So this was after Classic. The original Classic EverQuest was released in 1999. Then there was an expansion, Ruins of Canark, and then Scars of Velius. So the second expansion, that's when I started playing the game. And let me tell you, I absolutely loved it. I had so much fun. My brother and I would group and go everywhere. We would eventually join a guild. We would rise through the ranks of the guild I became one of the co-leaders. My brother became the main tank of the guild. We would raid, we would group, we would go on adventures. It was simply amazing. And honestly, if I think back into my personal gaming history and I think about some of the experiences that I've had, almost certainly my experiences in EverQuest probably at the top of the list. And I mean, it's not even close. EverQuest came around at the right time for me to really have it form something that truly is indelible. Like, I have memories that I will never forget about EverQuest. Simply amazing. And the unfortunate thing is that as you continue to go on in life, sometimes you don't always follow the same things. You don't always play the same games. Even if you've loved them, you sometimes just drift apart. And that's exactly what happened with me in EverQuest. Right around, and I can't remember what year it was, but it was around when it was after Gates of Discord. So there were a bunch of expansions. I mean, EverQuest is still around, by the way, today. It is still getting a ton of expansions even today. It's insane that this is still up and running 27 years later. It's crazy. But I guess it was around, was it Omens of War? Did Omens of War come after Gates of Discord? So these are expansions within EverQuest. But I want to say it was post Gates of Discord that I really started to pull back from EverQuest. And I started to play it a little bit less. I was starting to get into EverQuest 2 more so than EverQuest 1. I was playing different games. I was trying different experiences. And just over time, I kind of pulled away from EverQuest. Plus, the game itself was evolving into a very different, maybe not very different, but into a different kind of experience than what I was used to. I always loved that classic EverQuest feeling. The feeling of the original 3 continents, the feeling of Canark and Velius. And even beyond that, when you started getting the Plains of Power, the Lost Dungeons of Norrath. I really liked the Lost Dungeons of Norrath, by the way, which I thought was just an awesome expansion with the instanced content and the dungeons and the different, what was there, a point system where you would gather points, then you could buy equipment and all this kind of stuff. Like, it was really cool. There was a ton of cool stuff about EverQuest. But over time, I just kind of pulled back a little bit. Now, as I pulled back, it didn't mean that I loved EverQuest any less. It just meant that I was going to focus on other things. I was going to play other games. I was going to have other experiences, which is totally fine. You can love something and still let it go, so to speak. But ever since playing EverQuest, ever since those years, and I spent years playing EverQuest, ever since that time, I've always tried to seek out other games that would give me that same feeling that EverQuest gave me. That same sense of exploration, of discovery, of not knowing what was going to be beyond the horizon, of not knowing what named mob I might wander into, of not knowing what they were going to drop, of doing research where everybody was kind of learning at the same time. I would go out to EverQuest websites like Alakazam or EQ Atlas because the game didn't ship with maps. I would have to go out to EQ Atlas. I would have to download my own maps, not for inclusion in the game, but to actually take those maps and print them out and put them into a binder so that I had a map that I could actually reference with location points included, where I could type /LOC, which was a command in the game, and it would tell me what the location point was. I could look at that point, I could triangulate that or look at it based on the map and the overall coordinates on the maps I would print out. I would find out where I was. I'd be able to navigate zones like that. That kind of experience disappeared. For the most part, it disappeared over time because so many people wanted more user-friendly kinds of experiences. And I can completely understand and respect why that would be, because the original EverQuest in its original form was not user-friendly. I mean, as you played the game, you would get used to it. But I mean, think about these kind of concepts. If you died in the original EverQuest, you would drop all of your equipment. You would drop a corpse on the ground, and you had to get back to that corpse in order to retrieve all of your equipment. That's all well and good, except for the fact that, let's say you were fighting a raid boss at the very end of a dungeon. Well, in order to get that body back, you'd have to somehow make your way back through that dungeon. And sometimes you'd go in there and things would see invisible. So it's not like you could even cast Invis on yourself and just make your way over to your corpse. Sometimes, and most of the time, mobs would repop. They would respawn in between the time that you were all the way back in the back of the dungeon, and now you're trying to make your way back through the dungeon. And let me tell you, the concept of a corpse run is not user-friendly. I mean, you kind of see that kind of thing a little bit in the Souls genre, but it's not like you lose your equipment. You simply drop whatever souls you're carrying on you at that point in time. And a lot of people look at that as a very punitive measure against the player. Just imagine playing a game and literally not having any of your equipment available to actually allow you to retrieve your corpse. You would drop everything on the ground. It was the kind of experience that nowadays, if that were part of a game, people would look at it and say, that is just way too punishing. But I loved it. I loved the fact that if I made a mistake, I actually could potentially lose my stuff. Now, granted, there were other ways to get your equipment back. There where you could pay a necromancer and they could summon your body and and you could get resurrected and all that kind of stuff. But the fact is that just by itself, a very player unfriendly kind of experience. Or think about the fact that when you died, you actually lost experience points. You could actually de-level in the game. Let's say you were level 45 and you had just dinged 45. Well, if you died the very next second, you might be level 44 again, which meant that let's say you scribed some spells. Let's say you memorized some spells in your spell book. Those spells would no longer be usable because now you're not at a level that you can actually use them. There are just so many examples of these kind of things. Or the fact that up until a certain level, if you were a mage or a mana user, in order to meditate, you actually had to sit on the ground and stare at your spellbook. You couldn't see what was going on around you. You had to literally stare at your spellbook. The entire screen was taken up by your spellbook, and you couldn't see a thing. And that's not even to mention the fact that the original EverQuest was based almost exclusively on grouping. Now, yes, there were some classes that could solo, and certainly when you were a lower level, you'd have an easier time soloing different mobs, but it was not easy, especially once you got beyond a certain point. You had to either be really well equipped, really well skilled, or play one of the classes that had it a little bit easier from a soloing perspective in order to continue to solo in the game. Otherwise, if you were going to gain experience, if you were going to gain loot, it was all about grouping. And that's really one of the reasons why the original EverQuest fostered such a community, because it was almost forced upon you. You had to group if you wanted to progress. And I have to say, and when I first started playing the game, I wasn't sure I was totally sold on that idea, that whole concept of needing to group with other people. But it didn't take long before I was camping with other people in the common lands, trying to pull the orc camps and just get some experience in the lower levels, and then move on to different dungeons, the gucks, whether it was upper guck or lower guck or high pass hold or runny eye or any number of dungeons. I mean, I have so many memories of everything. And those are just original zones, not to mention going to Ruins of Canark, the first expansion, Karner's Castle. Anybody? I mean, that was insane. That was like a train station. Train being the thing that happens when somebody just runs through a bunch of aggro mobs and they bring all those mobs to the beginning of the zone. There could be people just at the zone. You train to the zone, and then you better watch out, because those things, once the person zones out that those mobs were aggroed on, and by the way, I'm using some fairly standard MMORPG terminology. So if you're not like an MMORPG player, I'm going to try to explain things as I go. I think most of them are probably fairly self-explanatory, but I'm going to try to explain things as I go. But anyway, if you had a bunch of mobs that were following somebody, and they had aggro on them, and then that person zoned out, well, where are the mobs going to go? They're going to try to path back to their spawn points. But if there are people in the way, and these mobs are kill on sight, they're going to aggro on you. So, I mean, Karner's Castle was famous for that kind of thing, but so many zones. There's so much about EverQuest. So that's the original EverQuest. And I played EverQuest for a while. And like I said, I've never found a game that truly captured the feeling of the original EverQuest. And for better or worse, that original EverQuest experience no longer exists at all. Because, like we've talked about, the original EverQuest, we talked about this during our Nostalgia Trip episode. The original EverQuest has evolved dramatically over the years. So much so that the EverQuest of today does not look at all like the EverQuest that I knew, that I was aware of, that I loved. And I really hoped that there would be some way to recapture that magic officially. And we'll talk all about the official and unofficial ways of recapturing that magic in a little bit. But I really wanted something. And unfortunately, there really just wasn't something there. That is, until I learned about EverQuest Legends. Now, EverQuest Legends, and we're going to talk about the whole history behind how EverQuest Legends itself came to be. But I want to say it was probably around a little over a month ago, maybe, that I first really became aware of EverQuest Legends. Before then, honestly, I didn't even know it existed. I'd heard of it. I'd heard of the phrase EverQuest Legends, but I didn't really know what the heck it was. I was kind of curious, because anything associated with EverQuest, I'm going to be curious about, because, well, I love EverQuest, but I didn't know anything about it. And then I started to do some research, and I realized that EverQuest Legends sounded like it was exactly the thing that I've been looking for the last 20 plus years. Here is a game that is focused on that classic EverQuest experience, but with a bunch of modern niceties and amenities that make the game a lot easier to play for people who may not have as much time as they once had to play the game. Like, say, myself, because when I was playing EverQuest when I was younger, I was a college student, effectively, and I mean, I had time. I had time between classes. I had time after classes. I had time before classes. I had plenty of time because I didn't have kids. I didn't have a real job or responsibilities or anything like that. So what did I do? I played a ton of EverQuest. Nowadays, I've got a job. I've got a stressful job. I've got kids. I've got a wife. I've got a mortgage. I've got everything else. All of that stuff that comes along with being an adult. I'm a very different person, and I have very different time availability today than what I had back when I was younger playing EverQuest. But EverQuest Legends attempts to create an experience that is much more casual than the original EverQuest was, while still hitting you in the face with a nostalgia bomb that for anybody who played EverQuest back in the day, it's going to be immediately intoxicating. At least it was to me. We're going to talk all about that. I did play the open beta for EverQuest Legends. I intentionally limited my time during that open beta because I knew that the servers were going to be wiped, and I didn't want to put so much time into the game that by the time the real game came out, I lost all my progress and I had to start all over. I didn't want to do any of that. So I intentionally limited my time during the beta. I'll talk about my time with the beta and my impressions and all that kind of stuff. But I limited my time intentionally because I knew when the game was going to come out on July 28th, that's tomorrow from the point that this episode releases. When I realized the game was going to come out on July 28th, I knew that I wanted to experience EverQuest the way I experienced it before. I wanted to dive deep. We're going to talk about what makes EverQuest Legends unique in comparison to that original EverQuest experience in a little bit. But all I knew was that EverQuest Legends sounded like the game that was going to recapture and rekindle all of that feeling, all of those feelings that I had about the original EverQuest. It felt like EverQuest Legends was being designed for me. So obviously, I was very excited. I have played the beta. I do have the game ready to go for tomorrow. I cannot wait to start playing it. I'm going to talk all about my initial impressions and why I think this is going to be, at least for me, something that's going to truly be the biggest nostalgia hit that I have had in a very long time. And I'll tell you all why I'm so excited about it. I'll also tell you a little bit about how this might impact the overall podcast and what my thoughts are around there. So more to come on that one in a little bit. But before we get to all of that, we're going to start diving a little bit deeper into the history behind EverQuest Legends. Because even though for me, it felt like it came out of nowhere, there is actually some history behind this game. There are reasons why this game exists in the first place. Some of it's a little bit of conjecture, but there is actually a lineage that leads from that original EverQuest release back in 1999 all the way to EverQuest Legends releasing tomorrow, July 28th, 2026. We're going to begin diving deeper into EverQuest Legends, so sit back, relax, and come back with me to Norrath as we begin discussing EverQuest Legends. EverQuest Legends is an MMORPG developed by GameJawn and published by Daybreak Games, releasing on the Windows computer platform on July 28th, 2026. Like I talked about a little bit ago, we did have a nostalgia trip episode talking about the original EverQuest and some of my memories and experiences from that game. We also talked about the history of that original EverQuest experience and how EverQuest was created and kind of evolved from the concept of Dungeons & Dragons and then ultimately the MUD or multi-user dungeon, and how the individuals that created EverQuest originally had been really enamored with multi-user dungeons and wanted to create something that had a graphical experience and was basically going to be the evolution of online role-playing games. That is exactly what EverQuest was when it released in 1999, and it garnered a significant amount of praise and fans and players because EverQuest, I've got to tell you, was very much an addicting kind of experience. It was the kind of game that you sat down and you thought to yourself, I'm going to play it for maybe, I don't know, I'll play it for an hour tonight. Sit down, you begin going on some hunts with other groups, you begin getting some loot, you begin buying some spells, you begin just walking around maybe a dungeon or a zone that you hadn't really experienced before, and then you look at the time and you realize that it's 2 a.m. and you've been playing for 6 hours. That's the kind of game that EverQuest was. There is a reason why EverQuest was nicknamed EverCrack, because it was just insanely addicting. For anybody who experienced it back when it first came out, it was an incredibly addicting experience and something that people would literally just shirk off all of their responsibilities to play. Now, I never got to that point. Like, I never got that deep, meaning that I didn't do anything else except for play the game. But I would be lying if I didn't say there were some times where I looked at my schedule for a given day and I saw that there was a specific class that I was supposed to be going to, and I thought to myself, I don't need to go to that one. But I mean, I guess that happens with all college age kids. Like, nobody goes to every single class, especially the boring ones, especially when you could play EverQuest. No, but the fact is that EverQuest really did cause people to focus and lose time that they would otherwise be spent either working or doing other things, being social outside of the game, because why do you need to do that? Why do you need to do that in the real world when you have the virtual world of Norrath right in front of you? There's no reason. You could get all your socialization in with the game and get some experience points to boot. How can you go wrong? Anyway, EverQuest came out in 1999, and it was an immediate sensation that would spawn numerous expansions over the years and would evolve over time. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, when I was playing the original EverQuest, there was a certain framework to the game that really made EverQuest feel like EverQuest. But as with anything, as something evolves, it changes. And that original classic EverQuest experience did eventually change so much that people started to think, well, this isn't necessarily the EverQuest that I remember. This isn't that classic EQ experience. This is now becoming something different. So, aspiring software developers decided to take matters into their own hands. They basically said, all right, if Sony Online Entertainment, which was the publisher of EverQuest at the time, if Sony Online Entertainment is going to continue to evolve EverQuest beyond that classic formula, well, we're going to recreate that classic formula for players to enjoy, which is exactly why the EQ Emulator, or EQ EMU, project got its start back in 2001. We have to talk about emulation just a little bit, because when you think about emulation, generally speaking, a lot of times you think about emulation in terms of console games. You think about playing your old NES or Super NES games, or Sega Genesis titles, or Atari titles. And you have these pieces of software, these emulators, where basically, as long as you have a copy of the game, which is traditionally known as a ROM, as long as you have a copy of the game and you have a piece of software that can emulate the system that you're trying to play that game on, you can play pretty much any game released on any console. I'm not trying to suggest that console emulation is easy, because it's certainly difficult from a technological perspective. But we have it pretty good today. When you start talking about emulation for console games, it's pretty darn ubiquitous in that if you had a console released at any point in time, for the most part, there's an emulator available for it, and you can pretty much play any game you want for that console. Especially if those games are no longer in circulation or able to be purchased. All you have to do is go out to the Internet Archive, pick up a copy of a game that you otherwise own, and then emulate it and have some fun. But the concept of emulation for a massively multiplayer online RPG is just a little bit different, because unlike emulating a piece of hardware, unlike emulating a console ecosystem in order to play games that might have released on that console, emulating an MMORPG is a very different kind of experience because you're not creating a piece of hardware. You have to actually reverse engineer all of the software that went on that was actually used for that original MMORPG. And all the way back in 2001, work began on reverse engineering the EverQuest server code in order to create an emulated version of EverQuest. The intent being that if people wanted to have that truly classic EverQuest experience, well, these people, these fans, were going to deliver that to them because EverQuest itself had begun to evolve beyond the classic experience. Development on EQEMU began in 2001 and would eventually launch in 2002. Now, I have to be very clear about this whole overall release from an EQ emulator perspective. This was not a full-featured kind of thing. This was not the kind of situation where you download this emulator server, whatever. You download this emulator, you hit play, and then suddenly you're playing the original EverQuest. That's not what this was. The intent behind EQ Emulator was to create the server backend and the databases that could be used to run an EverQuest-like experience. I mean, specifically, the goal was to run EverQuest. But because all of this had to be reverse engineered, because there was no source code to be used, because there was no access to any of Sony's databases with all of their EverQuest information. When EQEMU was originally created and released in 2002, or when it was launched in 2002, all it was a server backend. It didn't have any of the data that would actually enable somebody to play EverQuest. So what ended up happening was a ton of different servers using EQEMU as its back end would begin to get spun up. Over time, the people that ran those servers would begin to populate those servers with either custom content, because a lot of times people would get EQEMU and they would say, well, I want to try something new. I want to try to do something different. So they might populate their specific database with different characters or different values for hit points for characters or damage values or equipment or whatever. And they would play around with this. It almost gave people a little bit of a slice of game design because they had the back end, and granted, it was reverse engineered. It's not the true Sony back end for EverQuest, but they had the back end and they could play around with it and do different things. Well, eventually, people started to get a little bit more organized because when EQEMU first came out, and I will admit that I played around with this a little bit back when it first came out. Actually, not right when it first came out. I want to say I messed around with EQEMU back in, let's say maybe 2005, 2006-ish or so. And I remember downloading EQEMU. I was able to get the server up and running and all that kind of stuff, but it was empty. It was nothing there. And I played around with it a little bit, but it ultimately for me was more of a curiosity because what I really wanted to do was play EverQuest. I wanted to play that original EverQuest kind of experience. I didn't realize at the time that I wasn't really going to get that. I was just going to get this shell that could potentially be built into something, but at the moment was effectively nothing. There were, however, efforts to begin to take that emulator shell and create that original EverQuest experience, which is exactly what happened with one of the most widely known EverQuest emulation projects that have ever existed, known as Project 1999. The Project 1999 project refers to the fact that the original EverQuest was released in 1999. So the intent behind that particular server, which was based on EQEMU, the goal behind that particular server was to recreate the experience of playing EverQuest back in 1999, which means that in order for that to happen, the people behind the server had to effectively recreate everything that went into that original EverQuest experience. All of the different encounters, all of the different enemies, all of the different equipment, all of the different zone spawns and everything else. Everything had to be recreated, and they had to do this based on their own observations of how EverQuest originally ran. Eventually, that Project 1999 work, the server, would eventually come online in October of 2009. And for the first time would give everybody who was interested, at least, or had the technical know-how, the ability to play an unofficial version of the original EverQuest. Because, like I said, by the time that we get to this year, 2009, in the overall timeline, the original EverQuest was no longer available. I mean, it was gone. EverQuest as we knew it was already gone at this point. So the fact that Project 1999 even existed was an awesome thing because it gave people everywhere the opportunity to play that original EverQuest experience. The original intent behind Project 1999 was to emulate all the way through the Velius expansion, the Scars of Velius expansion, which incidentally, like I mentioned, was the expansion that I got into the game. So the goal was to go all the way up to Velius and then maybe, just possibly, expand beyond that. Over time, Project 1999 would grow to encompass hundreds of different players on individual servers. It was pretty darn popular, especially for an unofficial EverQuest kind of experience. But at the end of the day, it was an unofficial kind of experience. And you might think that that would cause some contention between those unofficial servers and the actual owner of EverQuest, which was no longer at this point Sony Online. It was Daybreak. Daybreak is effectively the company that got spun off from Sony Online Entertainment. Daybreak now owns EverQuest from an intellectual property perspective. And over the years, there's been some contention, as you might expect, between Daybreak, which is the official owner of the EverQuest IP, and unofficial servers that might be out there. Because, I mean, think about it. There's always been this legal kind of discussion about emulation and whether emulation itself is actually legal. Generally speaking, emulating, the act of emulating a console is 100% legal. The issue is acquiring the ROMs or the software that actually runs on those emulators. Because if you don't own a copy of that game, that's effectively copyright infringement, and that's where things become much less legally legal. I mean, it's just illegal. So it is illegal to use emulation using a copy of a game that you don't otherwise own. And think about what we were talking about with this whole EQ emulator kind of thing, this EverQuest emulator. Well, I mean, the server was completely reverse engineered. So technically, Daybreak at this point, but Sony and Daybreak didn't really have anything they could say about it because it was reverse engineered. It wasn't using any of the source code. It was basically recreated from the ground up. So from that perspective, no issue. But then people started using the actual EverQuest client to connect to these servers. And these servers replicated the feeling of playing EverQuest. And they replicated it without requiring anybody to spend any sort of money. So you can understand why this would be something that Daybreak was looking at and said, I don't know that I necessarily agree with this kind of approach. Because they could be losing money. Now, at this time, Project 1999, which was probably the biggest emulated EverQuest server out there, it was still not that big. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people across the entire landscape. That's not a huge number. But regardless, Daybreak was concerned, and they knew that if they were going to allow this to continue, they had to put some official guidelines in place, or they could just simply shut people down. Now, shutting people down certainly was an option that Daybreak looked at. But at the end of the day, they decided to not actually go out and shut down this whole emulation community. They decided instead to work with some of the more popular emulated servers to create official licenses that basically granted these unofficial servers an official license to run their servers and effectively become unofficial EverQuest domains, which was crazy to me that this actually happened. You don't often hear about companies going that far to actually allow for unofficial uses of their intellectual property. But in this case, Daybreak was actually pretty darn open to working with these server communities. The thing is, though, there were definitely some restrictions that came along with these official server licenses. For one, there was oftentimes a limit on the total number of players that could play on a server. That limit was 1,200 players. So if a server grew over 1,200 players, they could not. They had to be put into a login queue at that point. Now, granted, Project 99 or 1999, I don't believe it ever got up to that high from a player count perspective. At least I don't recall seeing anything that suggested that the player counts ever got that high. But still, they had that limitation in place. There was also a limitation that nothing in the server, nothing in the code, anywhere, nothing could use official EverQuest code at all. Everything with the server or with the content or with the database or anything else had to be purely reverse engineered, meaning they couldn't use any of the actual code that was used to create EverQuest. They also couldn't release expansions around the same time as an official expansion that would be releasing on any live EverQuest server, meaning a server owned by Daybreak. So like as an example, let's say that Project 1999 had decided to release the Planes of Power expansion. And let's say that Daybreak was about to release its own expansion right around the same time as Project 1999 was going to release their expansion. Well, that was a big no-no. And Project 1999 actually hit this situation. They had to reschedule their own expansion release. Now, granted, it was an expansion that Sony and eventually Daybreak would have worked on. But in order to not fragment the community, they had to move their own release so that Sony could, or that Daybreak could release their own expansion. So there were just some of these restrictions that were in play. But regardless, the fact that Daybreak was so open to giving an official license to at least a subset of the servers. Now, granted, this was not something where you just sign up on a website and you get a server license and you get a server license. It wasn't like that. It was one of those situations where only a very small subset of the server communities did receive official licenses from Daybreak. And Project 1999 was certainly one of them. Like I had mentioned, it was one of the most popular ones out there. Moving past emulation for just a minute, because we're going to return to emulation, because the whole emulation path is how we would eventually get to EverQuest Legends. But even independent of emulation, Daybreak was actually looking at creating their own classic EverQuest experiences. They recognized that people wanted to have that classic EQ feeling. Now, they didn't go so far as to create a brand new game, but what they did was release what they called time-locked progression servers, otherwise known as TLP servers. This began in May 2017, and the way it worked is that Daybreak would release various servers that had different rule sets, and most of them would be restricted as far as what expansion they could progress to. Most of them began with the classic EverQuest experience, and then over a period of time, let's say just as a hypothetical example, let's say every 6 months, a new expansion would release on that server. So in that way, people could re-experience the original EverQuest kind of feel, but then also progress through future expansions at an accelerated pace in comparison to the other expansions and when expansions actually came out for the original live game. This was looked at as kind of a compromise between people wanting that classic EQ feeling, but not necessarily wanting to restart from scratch and not have any other expansions pop up later on. This was all based on the original EverQuest live code, as well as live code that was in EverQuest or on EverQuest servers at the time that the TLP servers began their existence. And like I mentioned, there were some rule set changes that would occur with some of these servers to keep things feeling fresh. Some examples of potential rule sets might be that maybe a server could only ever evolve up to a certain expansion, which means that its overall time-locked progression might stop once it reaches expansion 6, let's just say, as a purely hypothetical example. Or there might be servers, like I had mentioned, that expansions might unlock every X number of weeks. There might be some servers that had enhanced experience rates over what you would see in the traditional live game. Other servers still might have randomized loot at a certain tier of named mob. There were all these different rule sets that Daybreak was experimenting with their TLP servers. And it really did give players a chance to get a little bit more of that classic EQ feel. Now, Daybreak has continued to release time-locked progression servers over time. They started back in 2017. Nowadays, it's kind of sort of an annual-ish release. I would say that over the last few years, between 1 to 2 new servers have been released annually as far as the time-locked progression goes that Daybreak has been working. So it's not like it's a regular thing, meaning it's not a very frequent thing, but it does happen, I would say, fairly regularly. I mean, even if it's just one a year, that's still a new experience. Now, granted, people have to restart whenever they get onto those servers because, well, you're starting on a brand new server, you got to create a new character, the different servers have different rule sets. So this was just a way, though, of having EverQuest players who were really interested in that classic experience. It was a way of giving them a taste of that classic kind of experience. Now, of course, by this point, the whole classic experience in EverQuest was well understood by the EverQuest emulation community, like we talked about with Project 1999. But even beyond Project 1999, there would be other projects that would also try to give that classic EQ experience, albeit in an unofficial manner. And one of the biggest projects outside of Project 1999 was known as Project Quarm, which released in October of 2023. This was effectively an unofficial, time-locked progression server that would only go up through the Planes of Power expansion, and there were intentions of releasing custom content beyond Planes of Power, which the team behind Project Quarm would eventually start to do. They would actually start releasing their own zones, their own raid bosses, their own content, basically taking the EverQuest structure and framework and expanding it on their own, which made for a very interesting mix that a lot of people wanted to play. This one became very popular and arguably more popular than Project 1999. In 2025, it would become so popular that Daybreak would also, just like it did with Project 1999, it would also give Project Quarm an official license to operate, which meant Project Quarm was now part of the official licensed emulation server community. So once it got that license, it had to align with those overall goals and restrictions that were part of that license. Now, one of the key restrictions that was part of that license that did affect Project Quarm is the fact that the Daybreak official license makes it so that you can't use or you can't create anything custom in the servers that you run. Meaning that if you're going to run something, not only does all of the code have to be reverse engineered, but you can't deliver any sort of content that differs from what Daybreak had created, from what Sony Online Entertainment at the time had created. Meaning, you're basically creating a vanilla kind of EverQuest experience. Now, you could still time lock progression, you could still have it go up to a certain expansion or stuff like that, but any content on the server had to be the exact same content that was released on the live EverQuest systems, which meant all of the custom work that the Project Quarm team had worked on over the years, it had to go away. They had to decommission it. They had to take it out of the server because that represented an evolution beyond the original EverQuest experience. That team behind Project Quarm would not just throw their hands up in the air and say, hey, I guess we're not going to work on this anymore. It's actually a very talented group of developers, and we're going to talk more about that Project Quarm team in a little bit, or at least a subset of that team. But Project Quarm is still going strong today. Now, in addition to Project Quarm, which, like we just mentioned, did receive an official Daybreak license to operate an EverQuest server, there was another project that released in late 2024 known as the Hero's Journey. Now, this one was an emulated EverQuest server with a twist. This one included a cash shop. Now, this became an issue because up to this point, all of the EverQuest emulation that we've talked about, all of the emulated servers and everything else, they were based on the fact that they were trying to recreate an EverQuest kind of feel. And one of the key things that Daybreak considered when they said whether to go after these servers or not was the fact that if the server wasn't making any money, and not even just not making money, you couldn't even solicit donations from people who played on your servers. There had to be no money changing hands at all for these emulated servers to remain up and running. That was just part of the deal. If Daybreak noticed that any server was actually charging people money or allowing for donations or tips or whatever else people might call monetary exchange in order to get around these restrictions, as long as you weren't doing anything with money, you were good. The moment money started to exchange hands, things were not so good. And that's exactly what the hero's journey was doing. They opened up a cash shop. And as part of the hero's journey, there were a number of different permutations to the game. There were a bunch of changes to the original EverQuest formula. There was easier leveling. There was more of a solo-centric kind of experience. There was even a multi-class system that allowed people to pick up to 3 classes and multi-class them on a single character. Those features were just awesome. I mean, they were great. People loved that kind of stuff. Now, I will say that those features didn't exactly originate with the hero's journey. I mean, the features themselves existed in various offshoots of emulated servers over the years. But the hero's journey was the first one to really combine all of those different features into a single kind of EverQuest ecosystem. And let me tell you, this one became a big deal. And you might be wondering, how big and popular could an emulated version of EverQuest really be? Because at this point, the live service, Live EverQuest, is still going strong. So how popular could an offshoot, an unofficial version of EverQuest, running its own stuff and with a cash shop and everything else, how popular could it really be? Well, I'll tell you, the hero's journey had 30,000 users on its servers, making over $100,000 a month. This was so popular that there were players that were literally leaving the live EverQuest servers run by Daybreak to play and give money to the developers behind the hero's journey. And this was a major no-no. This is something that Daybreak did take notice of because they looked at it as, well, this unofficial server is now doing Daybreak and EverQuest by extension actual harm, actual financial harm, because there were people that would rather give money to the hero's journey as opposed to give money to Daybreak. So that obviously was an issue. People did love it. I mean, 30,000 users, $100,000 a month in revenue just through a cash shop. Those are insane numbers for an unofficial release. But it truly was unofficial, and because of that cash exchange, it was very much illegal. So Daybreak went after the hero's journey developers, and they did have that whole server shut down in September 2025 after bringing a copyright infringement lawsuit to the courts. This was a big issue. The hero's journey was not doing things the way any of the other emulated servers had been doing it. They were trying to make money. It was basically a for-profit venture, and Daybreak was not having it. And honestly, they were completely within their rights to shut down this particular server because you can't just make money off of other people's intellectual property. It's not right. And beyond just not being right, it truly is illegal. Anyway, that was shut down back in September of 2025. And like we were talking about, EverQuest Live was going fine. They had their own time-locked progression servers going. There were also a couple of emulated servers, some pretty popular emulated servers like Project 1999 and Project Quarm that were still going strong from an unofficial official capacity. But as we were just talking about, the hero's journey proved that there was actually some money to be made in having a revised version of that original classic EverQuest experience. One that would be a lot more user-friendly, one that would allow for easier leveling, even ones that would allow for character combinations and classes that never could have happened in the original base game. Now, at this point in our story, things become just a little bit cloudy because, on paper, if you look at the hero's journey and what it was doing, you will recognize that a lot of what the hero's journey was doing was very similar and is very similar to the concepts behind EverQuest Legends, which is the official release that's going to be coming out tomorrow, July 28th, 2026. EverQuest Legends was originally announced back in March 24th, or on March 24th of 2026. And this was a game that was being published by Daybreak and developed by a new company called GameJawn, which was an independent studio with prior developers who had run various EQ/EMU servers over time, with a lot of the developers coming directly from the people who had originally made Project Quorum and had worked on the custom content behind Project Quorum. So remember I mentioned that when Project Quorum got the official license, they had to decommission all of their custom content. Well, Daybreak took notice of the people that were actually running Project Quorum and effectively offered them an opportunity to create EverQuest Legends as an official modification to that classic EverQuest kind of formula. Now, the question becomes, why would EverQuest Legends be released and announced now as opposed to any other time? I mean, if you look at it just from a timeline perspective, the hero's journey being shut down in September of 2025 after making over $100,000 a month, the timing certainly suggests that Daybreak might have been looking at that and said, well, hey, there is money to be made here, so let's make some money. And I mean, I don't have any proof that says that the hero's journey directly led to EverQuest Legends. And my assumption is that EverQuest Legends would have had to have been in development before this whole hero's journey thing, because, I mean, that's not that much time between September of 2025 and March of 2026 when the game was announced. So I don't know anything for a fact. But what I will say is that the timing of all of this, fairly coincidental. I mean, it definitely feels like there could be some correlation there. Now, I'm not suggesting that the hero's journey directly led to EverQuest Legends, because from what I can tell, none of the developers that worked on the hero's journey are actually part of the EverQuest Legends development team. That development team has a lot of the developers from Project Quorum, which was that other emulated server that we were talking about. But what I'm saying is that the fact that the hero's journey proved that there was a market for this kind of experience, this EverQuest classic, but revised and made a little bit more user-friendly kind of experience, I'm going to say that I'm 80% confident that the fact that the hero's journey proved that they could make money at it is what would lead Daybreak at this point. I keep interchanging the two. What would lead Daybreak to decide that they were going to spend some money to make their own version, so to speak, of an easier, friendlier EverQuest Classic kind of experience. Now, you might be wondering, okay, EverQuest Legends, it's going to be an official thing. How popular could this be? Because we already talked about the hero's journey being the most popular. It was, by the way, the most popular emulated version of EverQuest by far. With having 30,000 users, I mean, those are ridiculous numbers for an unofficial EverQuest server. EverQuest Legends, by contrast, already over 35,000 pre-orders for the game. This is undeniably a big deal. Their Discord server has, I believe, at the point of this recording, around 40,000-ish members already. This is all pre-launch, which is absolutely insane. The hype for EverQuest Legends is totally real. And if you look at some of the features that EverQuest Legends has, you can see how it really is trying to create a much different experience, albeit with the same level of nostalgia that people expect from a classic EverQuest experience. You have all of the classic EverQuest zones, all of the classic EverQuest MIDI music, everything that was in the original game, even boat travel is in the game, which I honestly, like today, you don't want to sit around for 15 minutes waiting on a boat just to get from one zone to the next. So they did add some translocators where you can just talk to somebody and they'll just whisk you off to a different zone, which I think is a nice creature comfort. But they still have boats in the game, which means if you wanted to truly recreate that original experience, you could, but they added some additional amenities to make it so that you don't have to. recreate that original experience. And a lot of EverQuest Legends is like that. They take all of the goodness about the original EverQuest and they just put this coat of polish over it to make it just a little bit friendlier. In the past, like I mentioned way earlier in the podcast episode, soloing was very difficult unless you were a specific class or had a lot of equipment, a lot of really good equipment. In EverQuest Legends, soloing is pretty much a thing for everybody. Now, part of the reason why that is because in EverQuest Legends, just like with the hero's journey, you can multi-class. Once you get up to a certain level, you can have up to 3 different classes equipped at any one time, which means you could be a paladin, enchanter, monk, and you could get skills from all of those different classes. And basically what this does is make it so that the character you create can become insanely powerful in comparison to all of the other characters that you might have played from a standard EverQuest kind of experience. You have access to all of the skills. You can even switch classes as you progress over time, which means the single character that you create on a given server, you can basically take that character, you can run with it, and it can become insanely powerful. Even beyond that, the equipment system has been updated so that rather than just getting a piece of equipment and hanging on to it, you now have an upgrade system in place where you can upgrade pieces of equipment to +1, +2, +3. I think you can go up to +10 on any piece of equipment or weapon, which basically means it almost creates an action RPG-ish kind of experience because now you have a ton of upgrades available. You can keep farming a certain named mob, keep getting equipment, keep upgrading the equipment and becoming more and more powerful. You can even upgrade spells. You have, there was just announced at, I believe it was the Game Developer Conference, or it was one of the conferences just recently. I can't remember which one it was. Now, it might have been a Comic-Con, potentially. They just unveiled a concept known as, what do they call it? It's basically a rebirth kind of mechanic or a prestige kind of mechanic where after you got to level 50, you could actually reset back to level 1 and it would raise the hard caps for certain stats, which meant that over time you can get even more powerful if you continue to level up over and over and over again. This effectively creates a situation where EverQuest Legends can be played indefinitely. And as EverQuest Legends continues to evolve, there's going to be brand new expansions that come out. Not just expansions that may have existed in the past that might be reworked, but also brand new content. There is an insane amount of stuff planned for EverQuest Legends. And I've got to say, as an EverQuest fan, I am so pumped about this. I am so excited. I did play the beta. I have some initial impressions. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go into super detail because I limited myself in terms of playing the beta. But what I will say is that EverQuest Legends, even though it feels like it sprung into existence out of nowhere, you can very clearly see the lineage of different things and events over time that would eventually lead to EverQuest Legends being created. The question is July 2026 the right time to release EverQuest Legends to the masses? Well, I've got to say, based on the pre-orders, based on the overall hype surrounding the game, based on the subreddit community, based on the Discord server, I think the answer to that question is affirmatively yes. And I've got to say, I'm going to be there day one to play EverQuest Legends because EverQuest Legends is going to be releasing in full on July 28th, 2026. I definitely have some thoughts about what we're in for with that experience based on my own experiences with playing the open beta. As a longtime EverQuest fan, I'm incredibly excited, and I can't wait to tell you all what I thought of my early experiences with the game as we begin diving even deeper into EverQuest Legends. Now, before we begin, I do have to mention a couple of things. Number one, like I've been talking about, I did artificially limit my overall playtime in the open beta that was available because I didn't want to get super far and then have to restart from scratch when the full game released. Because at the end of the open beta, all the servers were going to get wiped and you were going to lose all your progress. So I didn't want to go too far. That being said, I have heard from other players who have been playing from the point of closed beta, which had a lot more time available to level up, and some of those people did, in fact, go absolutely wild with EverQuest Legends, leveling up their characters, min-maxing all sorts of builds, and doing all sorts of great stuff. And I did, of course, look at a lot of that info as I was doing my own research about EverQuest Legends. But I mentioned that just to say, and when I talk about the game, you're not going to be getting a min-max kind of experience from me. That's not the way I play these games. I mean, certainly I want to get the best equipment that I can. I want to make the best builds that I can. I want to get the best alternate advancement skills and everything else because I want to be effective. But I'm not the kind of person that's going to level up to level 50 in a single day and then go off and complain that there's no end game content. I mean, in fact, there is end game content here because of the whole difficulty system. We'll talk all about that in a couple minutes. But the fact is that anytime you hear me speak about EverQuest Legends, it's not coming from a min-max kind of perspective. It's coming from somebody who simply loves the game and loves EverQuest and has such fond nostalgia that I just want to experience everything. So anyway, that's the perspective that I'm coming at this from as we talk about EverQuest Legends. So you might be wondering, how was EverQuest Legends to play? And the way I'll answer that is to simply say that this was a 27-year-old game with a little bit of a modern coat of paint. What I mean by that is that anybody who played EverQuest back when it first came out will immediately be familiar with how, I'll say, challenging EverQuest can be to actually learn. Because coming at it from somebody who hasn't played EverQuest for probably 20-ish years or so, I've got to tell you, I was I forgot some stuff. I was not sure exactly how to do some things. I was presented with the user interface and I was thinking to myself, oh geez, I got to organize this thing. I remember having everything organized on my original characters. Everything had a place. Everything was perfect. I had a very optimal kind of setup. And now I'm starting from scratch. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is harder. This is harder than I want it to be. But anyway, eventually you get past that, and something that you will learn as you play the game, if you're returning to the game after having played EverQuest in the past, it's not going to take you too long to have a flood of memories come back about what spells to use when and how to set up your hotkey bars and different zones and different named mobs and everything else. And honestly, that experience for me playing the game after not playing it for years and years and years was a dramatic nostalgia hit that I was filled with warmth is the best way to describe it. It just felt amazing. I mean, I had played EverQuest so much when I was younger that playing it now and having some of the new features available, it felt like more of the same, but a breath of fresh air that was incredibly intoxicating. I'm just going to say it hooked me. And I will be honest, after the beta servers went down, I believe they went down on July 21st. It's been a week almost that I haven't been able to play EverQuest Legends. And oh boy, do I want to play EverQuest Legends. It has been hard to not be able to play this game. And based on what I've seen out on various communities and Reddits or subreddits rather, I think other people are feeling it too, because there's so many people that are experiencing some EverQuest Legends withdrawal, myself included, and I just can't wait for the game to release. So let's talk a little bit about that experience from my perspective. And then I also want to relay an experience that my daughter had with the game. She had never played EverQuest before, so this is kind of her impression playing the game after never playing the original, because I have seen some comments out on Discord which are basically kind of asking, well, hey, if somebody had played this game before, okay, I get it. You have nostalgia for the game. You're going to come into the game. You're probably going to enjoy it. But what if you didn't play the game before? Does it really hold up without that nostalgia pull? Well, I have some real world feedback to provide. I will let you all know about that in a little bit. But first, my own experience with the game. So I come from an era of EverQuest where things were not user-friendly. I mentioned earlier about corpse runs. I mentioned about losing experience when you die. I mentioned about the whole forced grouping kind of aspect, unless you were certain classes that could semi-effectively solo. Well, playing EverQuest Legends was a very different kind of experience. First of all, when you die, there's no penalty. There is no penalty for death at all. What that does is remove any of the punitive nature associated with losing experience or anything like that. You don't lose a corpse. You don't even leave a corpse, which I've got to say, for somebody who doesn't have as much time to play today as what I once had, it's a great change. It made the whole thing feel very cool. It also, though, and this is something that I'm not sure I'm totally sold on yet, it does remove a little bit of the risk-reward kind of factor, because one of the reasons why you might not do something in the original EverQuest is because you don't want to lose all your stuff. Well, you don't really have that issue now. So, hey, you see that named mob over there that might be 10 levels above you? What the heck? Give it a shot. What's the worst that can happen? You die and you respawn and you lose nothing. So I see the pros and the cons for that. I will say that from my perspective, the lack of losing experience and a corpse when you die is definitely overall a net positive. I think it really reduces the overall barrier to entry for just stopping and playing the game for a little bit and not having to really worry about losing anything. So overall, I think that's overall positive. I also really enjoyed the equipment upgrade system, where as you got the same equipment over and over and over again, you could combine them and get greater versions of those, like a +1, +2, +3 kind of thing. I thought that was a great approach, because as you're working to level up your various classes, you're probably going to be spending some time in zones and you're going to get some duplicate loot drops. Some of them might be usable, some of them might not be, but regardless, you can combine them together and create something even better. There's also the ability to remove different effects from different equipment and use them on other equipment, which I think is a really cool addition to the game. I didn't have a chance to truly explore this one. So just for awareness, the way that the game works is that when you start playing the game, you pick a primary class and a secondary class. And then when you hit level 10, you can pick a tertiary class. You can pick your third class. And that effectively then becomes the combo that you're going to use for the short term. Now you can swap the second and third classes out and about however you want, but each class levels up individually, which means, let's say you hit level 10 and you're a paladin, enchanter, monk. Wow, I can't even remember. Paladin, enchanter, monk, which was my personal combo that I wanted to play. Well, every class levels up independently. And when you hit level 10, every single class available in the game is set to level 10. Well, let's say you switch out to a different class. Let's say you've leveled that combo, the paladin monk or the paladin enchanter monk. Let's say you level that up to 15 and then you swap in a wizard instead of the enchanter. Well, your level goes back to level 10 because the lowest level of your classes available to you is now level 10, which means you now have to level up that class independently. At the same time, you are getting alternate advancement points, which are additional skills you get that can augment your overall skills from a character perspective. So you're constantly gaining good experience, even if you have to re-level characters. And the fact is that the game world is so huge, even in its classic form, even before any expansions or anything like that, the world is so huge that it gives you an opportunity to truly explore everywhere with your character as you level up more and more of your classes. But anyway, when I was playing the beta, I only got to level 10, and that was intentional because, like I've been saying a few times, I didn't want to go so far and then lose all my progress. So admittedly, my overall impressions are a pretty low level set of impressions because I didn't really go beyond level 10. But I will say up to level 10, it was a blast. So much fun. You might look at it, if you haven't played the game, you might originally think, oh, well, the graphics are old or the spell effects are old or the music is MIDI and it's not going to really feel good. And there's all these hot buttons to use, but there's all these different creature comforts included too. One of the coolest additions to the game is the fact that you can spawn your own instance of any zone, your own personal instance. You can identify whether that instance is solo or multiplayer. You can also identify whether that instance contains respawns or if it's just a single spawn of enemies, which means you can technically clear an entire zone. And you can also set the difficulty for that zone, anywhere from D0, which is the easiest difficulty, all the way to D4, which is the hardest difficulty. Now, the way that works is that as the difficulty raises, the overall hit points and damage that mobs do will increase. And also, if you can defeat them, they will drop higher quality versions of the weapons and armor that they would otherwise drop. So as an example, let's say you're hunting in a D0, a difficulty 0 zone. And you fight something and it drops I'll just make something up, a steel longsword, let's just say. Well, if you're fighting that same enemy on D4, on the hardest difficulty, that enemy might drop a steel longsword +4, which means that you don't have to level up and combine as many weapons in order to get that higher quality of weapon. So that's definitely something that's an attractive prospect, because the less time you have to spend to get really good equipment, the better you're going to be able to get your equipment loadout baked in and then continue to play the game. And speaking of loadouts, there are ways to have different loadouts for different class combinations. There's all sorts of stuff that I haven't even fully explored yet, but I am intending to once the game fully comes out. So admittedly, this is a pretty high level set of impressions for very low level gameplay, which is not the best combo, but I've got to tell you, as a returning EverQuest player, this was exactly what I needed. It was exactly what I needed to tell me that I'm going to be playing this day one. And I am probably going to be playing it for many months after, because even beyond the classic stuff, when you start getting into the expansions that are going to be released and some of the custom content that's going to be coming and the dungeon revamps, they're revamping all of the original dungeons and some of the zones and the loot and everything like that. Wow. I am so excited. And I am so excited to be able to tackle this as a solo kind of player. There is literally a way to solo every single raid boss in the game. Now, it's not necessarily going to be easy or quick, but you can do it, which means no content is blocked off to anybody. You don't need an Uber raid guild to be tackling all of these bad raid bosses. In fact, the max raid size in the game is only 8 people. So yes, you can gather 8 people and go on a quote-unquote raid, or you can solo it. Now granted, you need to have some pretty good equipment depending on what difficulty level and what boss you're going after, but it doesn't matter because the option is there. Now, there is also a cash shop from what I understand. I didn't really look too much into that because I don't intend to really use the cash shop at all. I plan to pay my monthly subscription and simply play the game. But there is a cash shop there that presumably has some additional features. Like I think there might be like class unlocks or race unlocks or whatever, because the way the game works is normally to unlock other races or classes as you play the game, you have to actually play the game, which might make it so that certain race and class combinations are unavailable to you until later in the game. Well, you can spend some money to get that unlocked a little bit quicker. Like I said, I'm not intending to do that personally. I just want to play the game and experience all there is to offer. And speaking of experiencing the game, I was going to play this game no matter what, but I really wanted to play the game with my daughter. Now she's 10. She is 10 years old. She never played the original EverQuest. The majority of the games that she plays are very modern experiences. And while she has tried some retro games, a lot of times she gets a little turned off by the experience, primarily because retro-styled games are just a little bit more cumbersome. The graphics don't look as good. The controls are often not quite as streamlined. And as she sat down to play the game, and I was going to group with her, so I wanted to make sure that we grouped together. So she made an erudite druid. I made a human paladin. And I'm not going to go over all the subclasses. I mean, she made an erudite druid cleric. I made a human paladin enchanter. And she started all the way across the world in Eridan. I started all the way across the world in Freeport. So first of all, we had to figure out how to actually join up together to actually group. We worked all that kind of stuff out. And as I was navigating the zones and walking around, I was just thinking to myself, wow, this is such a huge world. It enveloped me the same way that EverQuest originally enveloped me back when I was younger. But anyway, we started grouping, and I could tell that her initial impression was not exactly positive because she didn't understand the controls. She didn't understand movement. She's not really familiar, or she hadn't been familiar with computer-based controls and using a keyboard and a mouse, because most of what she does is with a controller or a touchscreen. So she was really not used to this. She had never played EverQuest before. She had heard me talk about it because, I love EverQuest. So at different points, I would talk about it. But I was concerned. I spent the money for the pre-order and everything to get her set up on her own account, and I had my account, but I was a little concerned that, like we've heard some feedback out on the Discord, that people who don't have that nostalgia may be turned off from the game. Well, we played for maybe an hour, hour and a half, maybe up to 2 hours, and she just was not feeling it. And I started thinking to myself, great, she's not going to want to play this one. I'm going to play it myself or with other people from the community, which is fine, but I really wanted my daughter to have that same feeling, that same experience that I did. So we tried it again. We had tried it one night and she wasn't really feeling it. We tried it again, and then somehow things started to click. And she started to really, really get into the game. And it was, first of all, it was amazing to see, because I just thought to myself, yes, you're seeing the same stuff that I saw back when I was younger. And it doesn't matter that the game looks like a game from 1999. It doesn't matter that it sounds like a game from 1999. It doesn't matter that the controls are not necessarily the smoothest or the most user-friendly. There's just something good here. So much so that my 10-year-old daughter is now looking forward to playing EverQuest Legends when it releases on July 28th. I'm about to say October. And I was like, no, not October. July 28th. She is looking forward to playing that game just as much as I am. So the answer to the question, do you need nostalgia to play EverQuest Legends and actually enjoy it? You don't. It probably helped that I was with her, because my nostalgia is so huge that it probably enveloped her and probably just infected her by osmosis. But putting that aside, you don't need to have played EverQuest before in order to appreciate what EverQuest Legends is. You do have to give it some time, and you do need to let yourself get whisked away by the experience. If you do that, I think you're going to find something that is truly impressive and something that you could potentially even love, just like I love it today. Now, like I said, my impressions are fairly limited, but I'm intending to play this game hard. So much so, and that's actually going to be something I want to talk about for just a couple minutes. As we embark upon year 5 of the podcast, I recognize that there is limited time in the day, and I also recognize that I really want to dive deep into EverQuest Legends. So I have made the decision that for at least a short period of time, I am going to be taking a brief hiatus from Classic Gaming Today. What that means is that the main Classic Gaming Today feed is going to stop having new episodes released for a period of time, because I really want to play EverQuest Legends. And I honestly have not taken a break from playing games for the podcast and solely for the podcast ever since I started it over 4 years ago. So this is, I hope everybody can give me a little bit of grace with this one as I play something that I've been wanting to play now, and that is pulling me back to a time of my life that I have such intense nostalgia for. I hope everybody can understand where I'm coming from. I am not abandoning this community at all. Our Discord server is going to remain up and running. I'm going to still be out there. Our Patreon content is going to continue without issue, so I will still be releasing brand new Patreon episodes with Classic Gaming Today expansion pack. But as far as the main Classic Gaming Today feed, that is going to be going on a little bit of a hiatus. Now, that being said, I am also going to be documenting my experiences playing EverQuest Legends. And if you're interested in hearing about that and hearing about all of my experiences and diving really deep into the game, then I do have some news for you. Because as part of this overall experience, I am going to be standing up a side project. I'm going to be standing up a separate podcast for the interim, for the foreseeable future, called Return to Norrath. And this is going to be an EverQuest Legends exclusive podcast. This is meant to be my way of documenting and talking about all of my experiences as I play EverQuest Legends beyond the limited impressions that I've had up to this point. The intent here is to have equal parts adventure and nostalgia bomb. I'm going to include various stories from when I used to play EverQuest when I was younger. I'm going to include stories of different encounters and experiences that I have as I'm playing EverQuest Legends. We're going to mix it all in with music and everything else, maybe even have some guests on as we go. That is something I'm excited about. Admittedly, I don't know exactly what the future holds because it could be something where I play EverQuest Legends for a month, I record a few episodes of Return to Norrath, and then that's it. And it's like, okay, I got my fill. I am back to CGT. Or it might be something where that podcast, that new podcast, continues to grow. Honestly, I don't know what's going to happen. All I know is I do not want to leave all of you, certainly. That's why I'm going to continue being active on the Discord. I'm going to continue to be releasing Patreon episodes. I'll keep everybody up to speed with what's going on, both out on Discord as well as on our Patreon feed. But this is something I really want to do. And as I was thinking about the path forward, I was wrestling with this decision for a while because I don't want to stop what I'm doing. But at the same time, I feel very strongly about wanting to experience EverQuest Legends in full. I know that not everybody is going to join me for that journey, but I truly am hoping that at least some of you do, because I would love, especially if you've played EverQuest before and you have that nostalgia for the game, join me on the new podcast. Like I said, this one's not going anywhere. It's just going on hiatus for a little bit, but join me over there. It's not, that podcast admittedly is not released yet. I'm trying to get the first episode released by Tuesday. So by the day of release, I'm trying to get that out there. Once it is released, I will update the show notes here with a link to the podcast. I'll obviously announce it out on Discord so everybody has links for anybody who may be interested in listening to my experiences and journeys as I return to Norrath. So anyway, I wanted to let everybody know about that path forward, at least for the foreseeable future. This decision did not come lightly. Trust me, I've been thinking about this back and forth, but as the release has gotten closer and closer, I realized that I really want to play this game, and I want to play it so hard that I don't think I'm going to have as much time for doing the normal CGT kinds of stuff. So I hope everybody can understand where I'm coming from. If you want to still hear me talk about stuff, like I said, go check out Return to Norrath. I'll have the link out there as soon as the first episode is posted. Who knows what happens? Maybe it becomes a big deal and it becomes a haven for people who play EverQuest Legends. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where you can never tell, but I do know that I don't want to lose that spark of sharing my ideas and everything else with all of you. So I knew I wasn't just going to stop doing everything and just play the game. I want to share all of that, but I also don't want Classic Gaming Today to become an EverQuest podcast, because that's just a dramatic departure from what it has historically been, which is why I'm spinning off that separate effort. We'll see how everything goes. But regardless, putting all that aside, EverQuest Legends is a remarkable game. I am so hopeful that it continues to be remarkable as it approaches its full release. If you want to find me out there, you can find me on the Kano server. That's Qeynos. And some people pronounce it Kinos. I pronounce it Kanos. Whatever. I don't know which one is right. But I will be out on the Kano server. My name is going to be Anthonius. So anybody who wants to seek me out over there, I will be there. Anybody who wants to listen to my experiences as I return to Norrath, definitely seek out the Return to Norrath podcast, which will be releasing hopefully its first episode as of tomorrow, July 28th. That is my goal. Hopefully that happens. We'll see. I mean, the first episode is going to be a little bit of a recap as far as my prior experiences, so it's not necessarily going to be new for anybody who's been a long-time listener of this podcast, but hopefully it sets us off on a path to continue to deliver content with that as I re-experience and continue to experience EverQuest Legends, a game that I am almost positive. Now, granted, I can't give it a Pantheon entry yet because it hasn't even come out yet, and that would be wrong. But I am almost positive if this checks all the boxes that I believe it's going to check, I can almost guarantee that EverQuest Legends is going to become the newest inductee into our Pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on EverQuest Legends. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to once again remind everybody that we are going to be going on a short hiatus as I begin re-exploring Norrath via EverQuest Legends. If you want to hear all about my exploration and my experiences in that game, I encourage you to seek out and join and subscribe to Return to Norrath, an EverQuest Legends podcast. That should be available by Tuesday morning. That is my hope. Should be available by Tuesday morning, July 28th. If not, let me know and I'll make sure that it gets out there. It's definitely, Discord is going to be the best way to get in touch with me, or email or whatever. However you want to get in touch with me, definitely do that. But if you are interested in hearing about my experiences as I play EverQuest Legends, Return to Norrath is the place to do it. Anyway, I'm going to be over there for at least a few weeks as I play that game and enjoy myself a little bit and not focus so much on other retro kinds of experiences. But I promise you, I will see you all again. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.